Hi everyone, welcome to the Sea Brigade. Today is a solo episode. If you didn't hear last week's podcast, Emily is out on a family trip right now, so I'm doing this solo. I realized there were some problems with the third episode of our True Detective podcast getting pushed out for the RSS feed, but every podcast gets published on YouTube at least, so while we work out what happened with our RSS feed manager, we'll figure it out. Make sure that episode gets out there. And for those of you who are listening, I really appreciate the commitment. Right about now, we have around, I would say, like 100 listeners, and back during the heyday of Broadchurch, we were hitting like 400, 500. But you know what, listeners are listeners, and we're really glad to have you. And especially when there's podcasts out there that they put more money and time into it than we do. I mean, I pay for the podcast hosting myself. We don't do ads, so I'm really happy just to have some listeners. But for the 100 or so of you out there listening, I'd really love to get some feedback. So you can always write in at seabrigadepodcast@gmail.com. And you know what? With that out of the way, I say, let's tackle season 2, episode 4 of True Detective. Down Will Come, and I really should start from the end because that's what we want to talk about, right? Is that shootout sequence, that nearly 9-minute sequence of could say action. I think the focus may be the violence and just kind of the horror. Like, this is far from a fun shootout sequence, kind of set the scene of this. Me and my roommate were in a hotel in Columbus, Ohio, like a total roach motel, and we're watching this episode of True Detective. We're both like lying down in our beds, and when the shootout sequence went down, I sat up and was like clutching a pillow because I was just like, I was so tense. And the ending left me stunned when it ended on that freeze frame. Like, I thought something was wrong. I thought something happened to the television cable, and all I can do is think about what I just watched and what the consequences would be, and like, oh my god, what's running through their heads. So the special detail, or the special investigators, are going in to catch this guy, Lido Amarilla, who's one of his prostitutes pawned Ben Casper's stuff. So when this crew is heading there, it's probably 10 or 11 cops. And then this machine gunner starts shooting, and he takes out a cop. So our protagonists take cover behind these cars. Ray, Annie, Paul, and Teague Dixon. And this bomb goes off. And like the protesters here, the cable crew that is, like the news crew that is covering the protest, sees the bomb. They start filming that. And then Frank and his wife, Jordan, can also see the explosion. And something that makes me think that Amarilla and his crew were behind it was the fact that, this bomb goes off and this machine gun fire continues. And if this guy attacking the police wasn't in on this bomb going off, you think he'd get out of there, right? Like, oh my gosh, this building's exploding, what's happening? But you get the idea, if this explosion happens and this guy keeps shooting, then whatever Amarilla was into, of these Santa Morte guys, you get the idea that they would, like, they're destroying evidence, or they're making it sure that, whatever cops do get there, they're not going to know what nefarious things were going on there. And it really makes you think, if Amarilla was really just a pimp, why does a pimp have to blow up his stuff? It's got to be something way, way more messed up. But anyway, so this machine gun fire continues. Paul moves from one car to another, kind of moves, and then like Teague just gets taken out, and that was this moment when me and my roommate were just like, holy shit. I think my roommate might have just said like holy fuck or something. Like it really did take us by surprise, and it was just a violent shot. Like a chunk of Teague's head got blown off, and it was really not disturbing, but just like really surprising. And suddenly I felt concerned for our characters, because this was a shootout where with killing Teague, you established named characters could be killed right now. And I think by the end of it, someone on Reddit said there were 6 to 7 dead cops, and lots of protesters shot. Definitely lots of civilians shot. Someone said like, maybe up to 20. And there are a few cartel guys, like 4 to 5 at most. So the cartel taking the smallest hit here. And at the end of the sequence, Amarilla kills a hostage while screaming. And I only knew this because it's in the script. He screams something like, "Death's mother finds me." And is that occultish, or is that just something that someone in the cartel would say? Or does it have something specifically to do with his connection to Santa Muerte? I don't know. And then he shoots that hostage, and then Paul and Ray just tear him up. And, he's still got a loaded revolver. They're completely in the right to do that. But as soon as they shot him up, all I could think was like, oh no, like what was this raid for if we didn't even get the guy who you wanted to talk to about Ben Casper? Why did his girl pawn Ben Casper's stuff? Like, what's the angle here? So, and then everyone did a fantastic job analyzing the looks everyone has, because Paul seems calm and collected. Then he takes a look at Annie and Ray, and Annie is disturbed. She gets down to, like, basically crouches to her knees. Ray does that same kind of like squat thing. And I think Paul seems a little bit disturbed or surprised. Like, he realizes how different he is than Ray and Annie. And though, Paul kept the most cool during this whole shootout, I thought Annie and Ray were both bad. Like, everyone got kills. Everyone stayed mildly calm and professional during this. We did get that tease where Annie was pulled out her knife, and I was, me and my roommate were just thinking like, oh my gosh, like, when Amarilla had that hostage and Paul and Ray had their guns pointed at him, the entire time I was thinking like, Annie's gonna throw a knife right into this guy's back, but maybe that's a little bit cartoonish or too perfect for the show. But yeah, and then the shootout happens, and then the freeze frame, and I'm just left being like, oh, like all I can think about is like who's gonna get chewed out for this. Like, you could easily see this coming back to Annie, because she led a raid in episode 1 that went bad because it was a raid on a completely illegal business. But now that Annie has done, she's kind of proven in her past that she's kind of eager to do these raid type missions. Is that something that is going to, maybe Chesani and the Vinci Police Department are going to use that against Annie, saying, hey, look, you led us into this warehouse, and now the entire Vinci Police Department is basically dead. Is that something Annie's going to deal with next week? Maybe. And there are ideas about this kind of being the equivalent of, the Ben Casper case gets closed because you killed a pimp, and that's exactly what the Vinci Police Department wanted, was a pimp to put this murder case on so the special investigation comes to a halt. But now that we have, talked about the ending, I say we start from the beginning. And I notice I'm using kind of like a second person pronoun there with a we, but that's just kind of podcast language, I think. I'm so used to having Emily around. It sounds like I'm going a little bit cuckoo, right? But let's continue. So, the first scene in Down Will Come is Frank yelling at his like gardener, and we find out that Frank's avocado trees bear no fruit, which, on one hand, yes, is a pretty obvious fertility metaphor, but there's also kind of like a sweet irony here, in Frank getting like exactly what he deserves. So, one of the ways that Frank has made this money is by partnering with Ben Casper and industrial tycoons who do things like waste management, waste cleanup, waste dumping. And I think it's pretty heavily implied that Frank, in some ways, at least allegorical for the real life heavy pollution in Vernon, California. And like the way Frank has made his money in Vinci, I think, is in part by giving these industries a way to dump their toxic waste. We hear in the very first episode or the second episode, we hear this description that Da Vinci is like one of the most heavy polluted. They create so much toxic waste, and I think this is kind of isn't a kind of sweet irony that Frank, who maybe gets rich because he gives companies a place to dump their waste, his own soil is, polluted. There's something wrong with it. His avocados will bear no fruit in this soil. So I think it works as a metaphor in two ways. Not just, Frank and his wife are having trouble producing the child. Frank also maybe kind of deserves this in some way for the way he's polluted everyone else's soil. We figure out that, we figure out basically what's Paul's deal in some ways this episode, because, when Paul was getting super drunk in the club last week, there were some speculations about, like, maybe Paul's going to wake up with a man, and while that wasn't so explicit this week, Paul did wake up with his old war buddy, and there are implications there. There's nothing concrete, but I think this comes as close as we're going to get to the fact that Paul is gay. And at least, that only comes at 4 of the 8 episodes. This isn't something that we're going to have to wonder for the rest of the season, thank goodness. But, Paul is not exactly happy about his new revelations. In fact, he proceeds to leave that place and just keeps screaming. And then he tries to go back into his own apartment. He's harassed by the paparazzi. So it's not a great day for Paul. Though this is a great episode for Paul and people who want to know more about Paul. Next, Annie and Ray are talking about like corruption. I believe the scene opens up in the mechanic shop where you see the burnt out Cadillac. And Ray is suggesting that what's going on here with the special investigation from the state's attorney is the state's attorney doesn't really care about putting Chesani in jail. This is more like a shakedown, and that they just kind of want their cut of Vinci's pie. Though he's warning Annie that what she's doing by investigating Chesani is going to come back to bite her, saying that any deal that Chesani makes with the state attorney to end the investigation, one of the bargaining chips may be, all right, you can have a cut of what's going on here, but you need to fire, Annie Vaziri. Though Annie doesn't really, follow this. She instead, she explains to Ray in fewer words than this that she's dead set on solving Casper's murder, and she doesn't really want to focus on all this political game stuff going on right now. There's also a throwaway line, but it ends up being kind of important, I think, towards the end. Because Teague shows up, and Annie and him, share banter or whatever. But he does mention that he's working the pawn shop detail. So, there are a lot of things to look out for here, because Teague Dixon, in a lot of ways, leads everyone to this shootout, which could seem suspicious, except for the fact that Teague gets his head blown off. Because if Teague's working the pawn shop detail, if he brings Paul to this pawn shop, and then Teague's CI leads them to the warehouse, people I think were suspicious, like, oh, maybe Paul or maybe Teague is setting all this up. I think the alternative is he's a better cop than he lets on, but he still gets dead by the end of this episode. So, to what end all these points matter, I'm not sure. Frank talks to a guy in a coffee shop named Armin, and I didn't really get a pickup on what ethnicity these guys were, and I feel like we're operating in a television universe where all the gangs and criminal families are all like one ethnicity, because like Frank's like, I'm not coming to the Russians or the Mexicans, I'm bringing this to you. And just from the name Armin, I mean, there's so many possibilities for what this particular family could be. Persian, Greek. Wikipedia says the name Armin has to do with the Zoroaster religion, but you know what? Let's say Greek. Let's say this is a Greek mafia, because you know what? I love The Wire, so I'm going to leave it at that. But he's talking to this guy Armin because he needs someone to set up his newfound club with drugs, and you know, this is only one of many instances of Frank shaking down people again. Though this one I do like more than others, particularly because of the banter between, let's just say, the Greeks and Frank, because he's throwing all these sugar cubes into this coffee, and the guy says, you know, all that sugar, Frank, I wonder, you know, you don't lose your teeth. And he says, you know, that's the only way I can keep down your coffee. And by the way, I never lost a tooth. I never even had a cavity. Some people hate this line. Some people hate this dialogue. Some people hate Frank's dialogue in general. And you know what? It really differs from scene to scene for me. This stuff I really liked. The stuff later on was a little bit weaker. But not everyone's lines are always going to be of the same strength. But, you know, if we're picking and choosing, this is a great Frank scene, I think. The one where he's talking to the guy running the apartments or the tenements, that one's less good. This one's pretty good. So what happens next is that Ray picks up Paul. Paul is pretty hungover. He's pretty upset about waking up with the guy not being able to get to his apartment, so he can't shower or really have a normal life right now. And Ray sees this, and you can get the idea that Ray has been through something similar to this. So Ray offers him a cure from the glove box, and there's all sorts of stuff in there. There's pills, drugs, and then there's, you know, like a little flask of Smirnoff. And this is both really good development on Paul's behalf, because this is probably where Paul is the most honest with us and any other character in the show. But there's also good Ray stuff, because Ray, I don't know, Ray is just like a good friend or good caretaker here. Arguably, he gives better advice and is like taking care of Paul better than we've ever seen him take care of Chad. And if only Chad were more like Paul, maybe Ray would do a better job raising the kid. Anyways, so like Ray is saying like, hey, like I looked up that Black Mountain stuff. You know, you've been to Fallujah, now you've seen some shit. I'm sure everything else, you know, in life is just a cakewalk. And Paul says, you know, just the opposite, actually. And he's kind of spacing out, and he says, you know, I did everything they said, army, police, but it doesn't matter. I've been listening to them so long, I don't know who I am. And Ray just kind of offers up the answer, like you're a survivor. And then, you know, he's talking about, I can't get to the hotel, the paparazzi were there. Ray refers to journalists and the paparazzi as dog fuckers who would rather get it wrong first than get it right second. He offers then to help Paul in like a really like above and beyond way for just, you know, these are two guys who are only together because of this special investigation. You know, he says, you know, I'll get your stuff from the hotel, we'll take it to another hotel. Like something about that. I'm like, oh, geez, Ray, you're like in good guy Ray mode, and I don't know if it's because you're off the hooch, but you're acting like a good guy right now. You know, Paul says, I don't know how to be out in the world, man. Which is maybe I'm reading into this too much, but he says, I don't know how to be out. I don't know if he's referring to I'm closeted or just as a person. And I think it might be the second option. He just doesn't know how to be a person in the real world. And that's why he needs to be cop on a bike. And, and these promotions that are being offered to him, like that only makes things worse. Like if he goes higher and higher up in the world and he gets more responsibilities, that's just going to make it harder for him to hide. But, Ray offers up, he says, hey, look out that window, look at me, nobody knows how to be out in the world. He's, take a drink from that Smirnoff again, I'll get you some Pedialyte and let's go. What happens next is that Annie and Ray track Betty Chesani to a medical marijuana clinic. Now, Betty Chesani was the woman who slammed the door on Annie back in the Chesani mansion. It was really quick and you could have missed it. Anyways, Betty thinks that Ben Casper was nice, or at least says Ben Casper was nice to her. And she thinks that her brother Tony wouldn't have had much in common or gotten along with Ben, which is nice and interesting because I think we had plenty of reasons to believe that Tony and Casper, like you can just tell from the way that Tony acts and from what we heard of Casper, one's a wild party animal and one's way more like recluse and sheepish. And I mean, he goes to parties, but Tony did not seem like a submissive, passive person. And that's totally what Ben Casper is. So I can see why Betty would find him nice, but also, like Casper and Tony would not, mix well. All that aside, I think what Betty, the real bombshell that Betty drops is that her mother, the original Mrs. Chesani, died in a hospital in Nevada after she developed schizophrenia. She hung herself when Betty was only 12 years old, and Betty kind of implicates that Mrs. Chesani's therapist, Dr. Pittler, was involved, like his influence or his advice somehow maybe led to that suicide. So, I think the reason this is a bombshell to me is that now the Dr. Irving Pittler has been in way too many places for things just to be a coincidence now. Pittler was Mrs. Chesani's doctor, Ben Casper's doctor, and Mr. Vaziri friend, or student at least. So, how messed up is that? How many, ties, coincidences is that? Betty says, my father is a very bad person. And, I want to skip now to the Chesani Lodge, because I'm going to double down with some cash right now. I say the Chesani Lodge is our new Carcosa. And by that, I don't mean the occult, the voodoo, the whatever. All I mean is the Chesani Lodge is where shit's going to go down, or where shit has gone down before. I'm thinking this is the center of everything. I don't know if you can hear the police in the background, but I don't know. It's kind of funny. Interrupt my True Detective podcast. So, we find out, from Mr. Vaziri that Irving Pittler was researching communal living, which explains why this psychologist, therapist, whatever, was involved with Vaziri's good people commune, where Mr. and Mrs. Vaziri raised Annie and her sister and that whole family. And Mr. Vaziri says, this is probably the early 80s, and he says that Irving Pittler was a part of Chesani's Lodge. And furthermore, he recognized Ben Casper as a man who attended his seminars. And, he kind of explains it as, cross-pollination of these spiritual movements is one thing. Or, sorry, that's my note. He says, it's not unusual, these cross-pollination things. But I say, that's one thing. But this is way too many coincidences. And I think what, but Mr. Vaziri does by saying, it's way more unusual that my daughter became a sheriff. That, I think it's just misdirection. Annie is getting close to pointing out, there's too many coincidences here. and instead, he makes this about her, and then jumps to Ray and his aura. That could mean something, and I'm sure Mr. Vaziri believes in that stuff. But he does shut down Annie right when she's asking questions about, isn't it kind of weird that Pitler, Casper, the Chesanis, and you are all like spiritual Chesani Lodge buddies, right? Like, isn't that weird? Don't anyways. So there are a couple points here, and I know that I've kind of broken away from the chronology of the stuff, but since it's just me this week, I'm just kind of running wild, and I want to theorize. Theories are fun. So, in Chesani's mansion, Annie found soil readings for the Fresno area, which is north of Los Angeles. Later, Athena Vaziri mentioned that she doesn't do the wild hooker parties that happen up north. The missing girl, Vera, who, remember, we found out there was a missing girl named Vera in the first episode, and anyways, she last called from Guerneville, something like that, which is north of Fresno, near Sacramento. And we don't have a location for the Chesani Lodge yet, but like I said last week's podcast, the end of True Detective Season 2's intro has these shots of the woods, and in that dream sequence of Ray's father, Ray's father is talking about how he envisions, and this is all in Ray's head, mind you, but Ray's father is talking about how he has this vision of Ray walking out of the woods and being gunned down. So I'm unless this is all red herring and misdirection, I have a really deep feeling about this lodge and its connections to missing girls and Vera and sex cult stuff and just the rich and powerful like Ben Casper and Mayor Chesani. I think there are connections there. Anyways, moving on. Paul's ex M reveals she's pregnant, and then Paul proposes marriage to her, which is just the biggest mistake. And I feel for Paul because he is escaping from this reality. He really doesn't know how to be himself, I think. And this is that classic, obviously I think he's very upset about waking up, perhaps, and realizing he has feelings for his old army buddy. He can't handle being gay. So the fact that he got M pregnant gives him this opportunity to be like, all right, I'm not gay. I have a pregnant girl who is pregnant with my child, and I'm going to marry her. So, yeah, I don't know. And I didn't think about this just now. It's not my show notes, but isn't it kind of funny that Paul is the one to have a child? Paul, this likely closeted gay man who I'm sure the last thing he intended was to have a child. And clearly he thought, M was on the pill. So he was not, Paul and M were not trying to have a kid, and yet here they are. While Ray and his ex-wife and Jordan and Frank, all these characters who desperately wanted kids at some point, or currently want kids, can't have their kids. Well, Paul's got it done. Anyways, Annie and Ray visited the contaminated land that we saw in the very first shot of this season. The sticks with the little pink things on them. And they know that this contaminated land was frequently visited by Casper. And something I think is that his waste disposal companies, all these connections to companies that will take care of, your industrial toxic waste. I get this idea that they purposely poisoned the soil to make the land useless to farmers, so that it would be cheap to purchase for this rail project. And this is why I think that it's poetic justice that through Frank, who is organizing a lot of this crime. All these farmers are losing their ability to, do honest farm work because these, industrial guys from Vinci are maybe dropping off. I think mercury was one of the chemicals, or contaminants. And now Frank can't, plant avocados at his house, and he can't have a kid, and he's caused all the soil and farmland to be infertile, so that he and his wife together are having these fertility problems is only justice in a way. Moving on, Jordan uses her connections to reach out to investors for this rail project. And this guy who shows up says he's not really interested in land, but he does thank Jordan for inviting him and he tells Frank and Jordan, I'll consider it. And Frank is super impatient. Like, he's way too impatient to appreciate what's going on here, and perhaps too insecure about the fact that Jordan and one of her exes are palling around. And this is one of those things that frustrates me, but as a fan, or someone who was defending Jordan in last week's podcast, I think this is exactly what I'm talking about. Is clearly Frank is the impatient, kind of weak one here. Jordan, is kind of calling over whoever she can and taking these, hey baby comments from this guy. Because, if she reaches out to contacts and there's even the slightest chance that they will invest and help, the two of them get back on their feet with this rail project, she'll do it. While Frank, he only accepts, he doesn't accept no for an answer. He hustles and breaks everyone down until they agree, or he pulls out their teeth. So they're very different criminals, and they go about things in a very different way. And that's a difference between the two of them that I appreciate and like. And I'm sure that they got to where they were because they were able to balance those two sides out. You can't always be kind, but you can't always be a bully. And the two of them together was probably, or hopefully, how they got there in the first place. Meanwhile, Teague's pawn shop detail comes through. He brings Paul to this pawn shop, and Paul confirms that this watch, at least, that belonged to Casper was sold to this pawn shop, which leads to, the shooting eventually. Annie has a sexual misconduct complaint lodged against her by Steve. While I do think that this is petty revenge by Steve for the embarrassment of what happened in the office, and we could see last week he was kind of dickishly angry at Annie, even though she was breaking up with him in a super polite manner. I don't disagree with what's going on here legally. It sounds like fine logic to me that no superior can have a relationship with, an underling. If you rank higher and you hit on, try to date or have a sexual relationship with someone who's under you, that there might be that intimidating, coercive factor. From a legal standpoint, I don't know if I disagree with this. And I think this is a really complicated but really good thing to have in the show. Because, Annie says that line, this wouldn't be happening to a man. But her superior is of course it would be. Then the only difference is, if a male lieutenant hit on, a little deputy or something, and there was a complaint lodged, the only, Annie's superior says, the only difference was no one could use that line. And this wouldn't happen if this were a man. So while this sucks for Annie, because I'm sure Steve doesn't feel coerced or intimidated, and he wasn't abused by Annie, I do get the idea that this is petty revenge, but from a legal standpoint, I think Annie should watch her back, because this sounds like something that is going to be a very hard time to argue that she didn't do anything wrong. Moving on, the special investigations team is kind of in their headquarters or whatever, and they were theorizing that this woman who was caught on camera selling Ben Casper's stuff to the pawn shop, Irina Ruffalo, or let's just call her Irina. Irina was a hooker, and she slept with Casper, and then she told her pimp how rich this guy was. So she told that to Lido Amarilla, who was this pimp with priors with the police. So their working theory is that a prostitute slept with Casper, went back to her pimp, told this pimp, this guy is stupid rich. We have to rob this guy. And then, it was this notorious pimp with priors who tortured Casper for his wealth. And that's the theory they're working with. And given the way the shootout goes, I'm going to say that's the theory that they close on. And that's going to be the easy and corrupt way that they end this case, with little evidence that anything could have gone wrong. I think only Irina would be able to speak to the fact that they didn't kidnap, but who knows where she is? The woman who was selling Casper stuff. Who knows where she is? Maybe she was in the bomb blast, but she was not at the shootout. So she's the only one who could attest and say that no, we had nothing to do with Ben Casper's murder. Moving on, Frank and Ray have more bar talk. I really, really wish I knew the name of this place, because every time, all we can say is they're at that depressing bar. That's all we can talk about. And the bar has a Lone Star sign, and that's cute. And the music's fine, but if we're gonna have a bar in every episode, it'd be really great if we knew what the name of it was, because even Twin Peaks, they had a name for their bar that they went to all the time. It was something like the clubhouse, Anyways, Frank is trying to recruit Ray full time. He's kind of got this idea, the things I've got planned, I can use somebody like you. Black rage goes a long way. And he says something along the lines of, too, I enjoy soberish you. Your head doesn't dip and fall every time I talk. And the relationship is complicated because, Ray's like, hey, look, I'm not muscle. And you get the idea that, Ray does work best when Frank needs an investigator or an intimidator, someone to, track down this reporter and beat him up and steal his stuff. He turns to Ray for evidence collection in things that are good for a cop, not for muscle men, like Stan and Blake. Or I don't know if Blake's really a muscle man, but let's say Stan and Nail. He's got muscle. That relationship's complicated. And we would say, oh, look, it's falling apart. But they still keep meeting up, and they still keep giving each other information. So, yeah. I think in this next scene, Ray seems a little bit more mature in his interactions with Chad. In his farewell, at least, with Chad, he passes on his father's badge and technically, in quotes, Chad's grandfather's badge. And it's kind of really short and simple. Here, take this. Don't let your mother and stepfather see this. And where you come from will matter one day. And then he just kind of fades away into the bushes. So yeah, maybe there's a double meaning to that. Where you come from will matter someday. Because who knows? Maybe one day when Chad grows up, and I don't know how the show would ever work this through, but maybe Chad grows up, realizes that Ray's not his father, realizes his stepfather's not his father, and perhaps he realizes or learns someday what it is that Ray did to Chad's real father, which is this kind of horrible MacGuffin thing that is kind of dangled on the peripheral vision, this horrible thing that Ray did, which leads me to think that it's somehow worse than Ray just murdered a guy. This retribution is somehow torture or something. anyways, last note was that as the Special Investigation Team kind of is ramping up to this raid, there's some talk about the fact that the state tactical squad help, like the state can't provide, let's say, SWAT until later. And, part of the reason that this raid is disastrous is the fact that it's just PD with bulletproof vest, no helmets, no head protection really, lightly armed, no assault weapons. And is this going to be at the fault? Is it Annie's fault for rushing into this without SWAT, or are her reasons that we don't want to lose this guy, are those reasons valid? And I think that's something that will probably be resolved next week. I imagine a lot of what's going to happen next week is dealing with the fallout of what just happened, but I think that's something to think about. And, on the whole, since we've kind of reached the end, and I'm glad to see that we're kind of around just 40 minutes because I'm running out of podcast space, and I'm going to tone down the quality of the MP3, so apologies. But maybe there's a lo-fi charm to it, but I really need to save space. But I'm glad this is a short episode because this is one of those episodes that I just really enjoyed. And one of the things my roommate says is that, hey, every episode of this show is better than the last. And I tend to agree. And this one in particular, I get the idea that we're kind of going to be not free, because everyone's still got responsibilities as cops. But that moment in season 1 where Marty and Rust, they're not hired anymore. They're just doing this to solve the mystery. I feel like we're heading in that direction, because Vinci closes this thing by saying Amarillo was the killer. Then that leaves Paul, Ray, and Annie potentially free to go off the rails a little bit, and that excites me. But we'll see if that happens. You can always send in feedback to cbrigadepodcast@gmail.com. We do have a Twitter account. I never use it because I just, back when I had the Broadchurch podcast, I would just spam it with stuff. But please feel free to write in and send some feedback. Reading some fan email theories, suggestions, that always kind of livens up the end of the podcast, because that's a part of any show where you kind of wind things down. I really suggest reading the True Detective subreddit, and the reason I just said listening was I have to give some musical credit to Kevin MacLeod. We use his royalty-free stuff at the beginning of every episode, and I've gotten into the rhythm, we'll say rhythm. I've gotten into the pattern of using the Ravenette's Kill as the outro music for this show, because it was the club music in episode 2, I think. So, yeah, check both of those things out, Kevin MacLeod and the Ravenettes. And you know what? I think that's a C Brigade episode. So, I'll talk to you guys all next week. Bye.
I never